Hi, everybody. We have a great panel today, and I think other people will zoom in as we go, but to respect everybody's time, and because we only have an hour, I do want to go ahead and get started. I'm Patrick Rooney. I am the Glenn Family Chair in Philanthropy and Executive Associate Dean for Academic Programs at the IU Lilly Family School of Philanthropy. And it's my pleasure and honor to moderate this panel. What I'm going to do is, we've got a great panel with different backgrounds and different philosophical, ideological backgrounds as well. And each panelist is going to have up to 5 minutes to really kind of outline one big idea about what they expect the new era in DC might or might not have affecting philanthropy and or the philanthropic sector. And we're leaving it up to each of them. I've drawn their names randomly out of my Scrabble letters bag. And so we're going to go in that order. I will introduce each speaker at the time. There's a longer bio for each of the speakers on our website, and we'll make the recording and the bios available to anybody who's interested in them later. Our goal is to have plenty of time for each of you for question and answers afterwards. And so we're going to keep this main part of this, the first part of this, relatively short. So first up is Lenkowsky, and again, this was just random. Les is a professor emeritus from the O'Neill School and also from the Lilly Family School of Philanthropy, and he has been active in a number of jobs and volunteer positions over his career. But anybody who knows Les knows that he writes frequently on policy issues in the Chronicle and in other places as well. Just had an essay on patriotism in the Wall Street Journal, I think last week. So Les, you kick us off, please.
Okay, well, thank you very much, Patrick, and it's great to be with all of you, and especially my fellow panelists. There's actually been any number of things that have already occurred in the Biden administration I could comment on. One was reestablishing an office to work with faith-based and community organizations. The previous administration had canceled that and was really the first administration since President Kennedy's day not to have an office working with the nonprofit sector. We also see in the stimulus bill $1 billion additional for AmeriCorps, the National Service Program. The previous administration had actually tried to zero it out, and the program really hasn't grown since the time I left office in 2003. Now it will grow. But I want to just comment on one action that has hardly been noticed in the philanthropic and nonprofit world, but could have the biggest effect, even though it gives no dollars to any nonprofit organization, nor any tax incentives to potential donors. I'm referring to the increase in the children's tax credit in the stimulus bill. It not only increases the amount of this credit, but makes it fully refundable, which means that if you have no earned income and you have 2 children under the age of 6, you will be getting a check from the IRS of $6,000 a year. Estimates from organizations outside government are that this change, together with other elements of the package, can reduce the number of children in poverty by around 50%. So this is an extraordinary development that will have lots of impacts on the work that nonprofit and philanthropic organizations do. Some good, insofar as children who grow up in families that aren't poor are likely to do better in school, have fewer health problems, and so on. But there are also some questionable issues that are going to be discussed. Will these benefits reduce the incentive of lower income families to work? What will the effects be on the composition of families? These are issues we don't know. As a practical matter, The change has only been enacted for 1 year, this year, 2021, though most people expect that it'll be hard to withdraw a benefit that's been conferred. In addition, there are a lot of administrative challenges. The IRS, for example, has been asked to send these checks monthly. So families will get a monthly stipend as lower income or families in poverty need. But that's a big change in what the IRS does. We haven't been doing it for the earned income tax credit, another kind of refundable credit. And especially at the lower levels of the labor market, wages tend to vary a lot in the course of the year. And so figuring out what the proper credit will be could be a challenge. But that having been said, after 50 years of discussing the importance, the value of providing income to low-income families, rather than a plethora of social, educational, and health services, we now seem to have been embarked on an income strategy, for better or worse.
Thank you, Les. Okay, number two, I'm not going to comment in between. We'll just proceed from one speaker to another. Claudia Cummings is the president and CEO of the Indiana Philanthropy Alliance.
Hello, everyone. Good afternoon. It's great to be here with you guys all today. My name is Claudia Cummings. The Indiana Philanthropy Alliance, for those who may not know, is the largest network of foundations, corporations, and social impact investors in the state of Indiana. We focus on education, advocacy, and collaboration in the philanthropic sector. Our members are in all 92 counties, and in Indiana, philanthropy holds almost $24 billion in assets and gives out annually about $1.9 billion in grants. So I wanted to talk to you guys today a little bit about donor advised funds, particularly with regard to community foundations. You may not be aware, but Indiana is home to the largest network of independent community foundations in a single state. They hold about $4 billion in assets. And the reason I wanted to talk about donor advised funds is in addition to looking at what is and what's stated in the current administration, it's also important to keep an eye on the landscape and what folks might be asking to have happen. And so there are some folks who are interested in changing some of the regulatory environment around donor advised funds, particularly with regard to payout rates. And I thought it was really interesting. Every year, the Indiana Philanthropy Alliance surveys our members, our community foundation members, and we have a tremendous response rate. I think this includes all but 2 of them. And in 2019, donor advised funds gave grants at about 10% of their holdings, which is significantly above what private foundations are currently asked to give, and even above what some of the folks that are interested in creating a minimum payout might be searching for. So keep that in mind as we kind of talk about that today, that at least in 2019, that was pre-pandemic, and we know that they've given out even more this year than in prior years. We were giving out about 10% in grants from those donor advised funds. Nationally, we know that about half of all donor advised funds are held in community foundations, which is a little different than the commercial products that are out there in the DAF space. And so just giving you a feel for the size of the community foundation holdings. Right now in Indiana, we are engaged in community leadership across the state from our community foundations, which means folks have been taking a deep dive into community needs, listening, collaborating with key actors, and putting together strategies and putting those into action. Everything from targeted programs to reduce recidivism to quality of place initiatives. Why is this important? It's because community foundations serve as expert advisors to the donor advisors who are searching to identify key charities that could have a significant lever in their communities. So we know that there is an initiative, the initiative to accelerate charitable giving, that's being advanced by John Madoff, who's a billionaire philanthropist, along with, I confused my names, John Arnold and Ray Madoff, who is a college professor, Boston College law professor. And this has been signed on to by a number of organizations and individuals that are engaged in philanthropy. To me, I'm not certain why. IPA certainly believes that donor advised funds, particularly when administered through community foundations, are a significant tool in our philanthropic tool chest. But this initiative seeks to require minimum payouts and limit the lifetime duration of donor advised funds, which would limit our ability to have long-term strategies and the opportunity to pass down some of the wealth from generation to generation. The adverse impacts of taking such actions could include things like increased administrative costs, given the need for constant grant making through those donor advised funds that might not otherwise be necessary if not for the regulatory requirement. It also limits the time horizon that donor advisors are able to hold on to their funds and allow those to grow. It prohibits donor advisors for using this as a tool to make major gifts to organizations which they believe in strongly, and the list goes on. We at IPA are concerned about this trend. We are working to educate key policymakers, both from the Indiana delegation as well as nationally, about some of the concerns that we have, because we believe that donor advised funds, particularly those when administered by community foundations, are key tools in the philanthropic tool chest. Thank you.
Thanks, Claudia. And as some of us, and maybe all of us know, there are DAF lovers and DAF haters, and so I'm sure you will have provoked a few comments and questions when we get to Q&A. So thank you for your insights. At bat third, Brian Schlegel, Director of Research, National Committee for Responsive Philanthropy. Brian.
Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you, Patrick, and thanks to IUPUI for having me and for having NCRP in this space. I'm going to skip the who is NCRP introduction and just assume that most of the folks on this call know who we are. We're a national research and advocacy organization pushing for more social, racial, and economic justice giving by foundations and major donors. I'm the research director, and as I said, I'm really delighted to be here with my co-panelists. I'm going to talk a little bit about what I think a new era in DC might bring as it relates to regulations for philanthropy and the EO sector more generally. For me and for NCRP, I think the answer to that question is it's not going to bring a whole lot. I don't think we expect many new regulations. I don't think we expect many changes to the regulatory environment, to use Claudia's phrasing. And I think that there are a number of reasons for that I can go through right now. So number one, which is obvious, and I think my co-panelists would probably agree with me, that political capital is limited and that the Biden administration and the new Congress probably correctly thinks that they have bigger fish to fry right now from a policy standpoint than reforms to EO and philanthropy sphere. I think, I and the folks on this call probably think that those reforms, new regulations could have wide-reaching impacts for the causes and communities that, Biden and the Democrats in Congress care about, but whether they share that calculus, I think I'm a little bit less sure of that, and I think they're just probably going to have higher priorities than focusing on new EO regulations. The next reason is that the sector, generally speaking, I would say, Certainly the right wing of the sector and the center of the sector, and often the left wing of the sector too, is generally kind of hostile to new regulations, new philanthropy regulations. We see this when things like DAF reforms are proposed, but the payout regulations are just part of the proposal that's come out of the Arnold and Madoff package that Claudia referred to. There's a host of other DAF-related proposals. So we've seen it with DAF. We've seen it with any kind of incentive for greater foundation payout, for example, in the charitable stimulus package that was rolled out last year. We see it as it relates to reforms to prevent private foundations from overcompensating family members, for example. The list goes on. My point is that generally speaking, when new regulations are proposed, philanthropy sector experts and think tanks usually speak with one voice, like, this is not necessary, we do not need this, and it's going to negatively impact our bottom line. And I'm going to come back to that in a moment. Another reason, and I want to address one thing that Claudia mentioned, another reason is that we just don't have great data into great data that we would need to build like great policy. So respectfully, like I haven't read the IPA study on DAF, but you know, I think that we probably need more than just self-reported survey data from DAF sponsor organizations to evaluate whether DAFs are or are not meeting meeting their objective as a charitable vehicle, or sort of staying within the spirit and letter of the law that governs them. So I think that DAFs are just one example in the philanthropic sector. I think generally speaking, this sector, our data and our visibility into data on giving is at this point so fractured across different giving platforms and across different folks who are collecting that data, that I think that the sector has a lot of work to do on just establishing a baseline of like, what do we know about these kinds of giving before we can develop like really good policy related to things like DAFs or other kinds of giving. And then the last reason I'll mention is just that even if the Biden administration and the new Congress wanted to develop new rules and regulations, they'd have to find someone to enforce them, because as I think a lot of people on this call know, the exempt organizations division at IRS has been starved for resources over the last decade plus. If you read, for example, Paul Streckfuss's periodic updates on what's going on inside of EO division, it sounds like their capacity for enforcing our current regulatory scheme is pretty limited. So I think that that's another problem that just would have to be addressed before we put, or rather maybe at the same time as putting any new regulations on the books. It's a must. Circling back, I think one of the big questions that's sort of rising for me out of this the policy status quo that I do think is going to persist through at least the first term of the Biden administration. One of the questions that's rising for me is, well, two questions really. One is why is it that the philanthropy sector generally doesn't seem to pay a ton of attention or care a lot that their regulators have been incapacitated. The executive or the EO division at IRS has essentially been defanged. We can see that in data, as I said, reported by Streckfuss and others, that the EO exam rate is something like 1/3 the rate for individual examinations and something like 1/5 the rate for business examinations, and that rate has declined in recent years somehow. So I think it really does raise the question for me of like, what will it take for the sector to focus some energy, some time, some resources on building a better and more effective regulatory state. And then the other question it raises for me is how long can sort of the unquestioned legitimacy of elite philanthropy persist? I think, and of charitable institutions more generally. I think that the last few years we've seen, sort of cascading crises of confidence in what were very well respected, even sacrosanct American institutions. And I think that has a lot to do with the growing wealth inequality the country is facing. But I guess I wonder, given what we see in research like in Gilded Giving that showed just how far apart sort of elite wealthy philanthropy is from the philanthropy that most folks are doing. I wonder how long the sort of unquestioned legitimacy of charitable institutions is going to last. So I guess I'll leave it on that note of uncertainty. I think, by and large, over the next 3 years, it's very unlikely that we're going to see any kind of new regulation as it relates to philanthropy. But I also think that if philanthropy gets comfortable with that status quo, they risk getting complacent, because I think that we've seen that there's certainly a mainstreaming of a philanthrocritical perspective by folks like Anand Giridharadas and others, and I see no reason to think that will slow down. I think it will accelerate. So I'll stop there, and I'm looking forward to the conversation. And once again, just want to thank Patrick and the Lilly School for having NCRP here.
All right, thanks, Ryan. So again, I think when I said at the beginning, we wanted to have a broad range of intellectual and philosophical perspectives, and I think we're seeing and hearing that already, and we're only halfway through. So this is great. Thank you. Up next, Jeff Moore, Chief Strategy Officer at Independent Sector.
Thank you, Patrick. Good afternoon, everybody. It's probably never a good thing to start off speaking on a panel saying I'm going to answer a slightly different question than what was posed. So I'm not so sure that I'm really going to talk about an expectation. I'm really wanting to talk about a hope, an area of core advocacy that Independent Sector is making with this new administration. So let me start just by very quickly saying Independent Sector, for those who may not be aware, is a membership organization. We're the only national organization that represents really all parts and pieces of the sector at national scale. And in our public policy work, which I also lead, in addition to my strategy role, we're focused on three core pieces of work. The most pressing and the most present is what we have been living, of course, for the last 12 months, and that is how are we working with the administration, with the Congress, present and prior, to drive relief into the sector. So the question of financial relief, the most recent being the Recovery Act that we saw signed last week. We've made some real strides. Quite frankly, however, there is still a very, very long way to go. And some areas where there have been a clear miss, quite frankly, between what has landed in a signed package and what the real needs of the sector are, which will actually tie me to my third point. But in between, so, relief, now we would hope starting to think about recovery, the second of my three R's. So part of what we are trying to get policymakers, legislative, and the administration to focus on is now, as we shift to where the investments need to be made in order to drive equitable recovery and rebuilding in the country, that we are opening up our thinking about conversations like infrastructure, and making sure that as we step into those conversations, we're not just talking about critical things like roads and bridges, but we're also talking about fundamentally important investments that need to be made into our civic infrastructure. And by that, I mean the norms and practices that allow communities across the country to solve their problems, right? Whether it's by way of voting, volunteerism, service, that is our civic infrastructure. And it needs to be paid equal attention to roads and bridges. So that's a very large piece of our work, our advocacy work, and our coalition work. The third and final thing is coming back to a point I made just a moment ago, and that is around the third R being representation. So, I think it was less mentioned at the top of the conversation that the White House has reinstituted the Office of Faith-Based and Neighborhood Partnerships, which is a critically important, wonderful thing. The reality is, as the sector, right, the third largest employer of the private workforce in the country, 5% of GDP, we are inconsistently represented from administration to administration, right? And there's a price that we pay for that. We've seen that, quite frankly, in our COVID response. The fact that the sector was not clear and present in the conversations around how the Paycheck Protection Program was going to be fashioned, for instance, running through the SBA, which was not created to work with the likes of nonprofits. It presented us a problem. I want to be really clear that the Paycheck Protection Program has been invaluable in saving lives, saving lives and saving jobs in the sector. But at the end of the day, it was not the tool that it really most needed to be. So how do we change this? How do we make sure that the nonprofit sector, like its for-profit counterparts, are regularly represented in the administration? So we have, with encouragement of the Biden transition team, and now folks actually sitting in the administration, have been working on a package, an executive order package, that would start to put down some of the framework for that office to be followed, we would hope, by legislation. So I'm going to actually stop there and happy to answer questions when we get to them.
Well, thanks, Jeff. That's clearly it would be a huge step for the sector overall. Next, Joanne Florino, Adam Meyerson, Distinguished Fellow in Philanthropic Excellence at the Philanthropy Roundtable. Thanks, Joanne.
Unmuting. Thank you, Patrick. So it's an honor and a pleasure to be here today speaking to the students and faculty of the Lilly School. I'm going to talk today about donor privacy. Donor privacy as it affects individual givers to C3 charities is under attack. We're certainly concerned that those attacks will increase. And I want to talk about two things that are driving those attacks: the concept of transparency and the concept of dark money. So calls for greater transparency in philanthropy are nothing new, and both private foundations and public charities do have mandates for public disclosure in their annual tax filings. But individuals are neither of those things and have the right to be anonymous in their giving if that's what they choose. You might ask why individuals would choose to be anonymous givers. And the reasons go all the way from their religious tradition to the fact that they want to put the spotlight on their grantees rather than themselves. Government demands for more disclosure are not new, but we have to be extremely careful when that disclosure would affect and potentially threaten individuals. The case that most of us go to all the time, I'm going to do it myself today, is the 1950s when the Attorney General of Alabama demanded that the NAACP in that state turn over the names of all of its members to the government. And the NAACP rightfully declined, arguing that that was a violation of their members' First Amendment freedoms. In 1958, the Supreme Court took up that case and ruled unanimously that that was in fact the case. And unfortunately, that decision was weakened in some following decisions by the Supreme Court. In recent years, we're seeing bills filed in a number of states that would threaten the donor privacy of C3 organizations. And I want to be clear, a lot of those bills are actually written with C4s in mind, but they're written so poorly, and they talk about political communication or policy communication in such a vague way that they unwittingly capture C3s in their nets. What's been adding momentum to the calls for transparency and disclosure efforts is the concept of dark money, which is a term I try not to use unless I'm in something like this and I have to use it. But it was originally used to refer to as anonymous sources of money for elections. At this point, it's being used around any kind of anonymous funding to imply that something questionable or downright illegal is going on. We see it in criticisms of donor advised funds, and thank you, Claudia, for your presentation on DAPs. We also see it in mandates that Schedule Bs be shared. So the Schedule B, and I think you all know that, is part of Public Charities 990 that includes the name, address, and amount given by each major donor to that charity. The IRS considers that confidential tax information and has stiff penalties for its unauthorized release. Though there have been occasional damaging illegal disclosures of sensitive donor information, they have been rare. But state action is actually what's threatening that confidentiality of private donors. And the biggest case began in 2010 when Kamala Harris was Attorney General of the state of California and required that all charities soliciting funds in that state include the Schedule B in their mandatory filings to her office. A challenge to that mandate, there were several challenges to that, but the one that actually kind of took hold was one that was filed by the Americans for Prosperity Foundation. And that case is actually about to come to the Supreme Court. So, looking at all of the concerns about donor privacy, what do we expect in this new era? I'm not so sure I want to talk about expectations as much as, concerns. And it does involve all three branches of government. So in the executive branch, again, Claudia, thank you for mentioning this. Treasury has been working on regulations for donor advised funds that could easily affect donor disclosure. And it's important to note that this work is happening in a deeply polarized environment when so many causes have become political and when accusations have been made about dark money and hate groups. There's a clear danger that concerns about C4s and C6s could spill over to C3 organizations. On the legislative side, HR 1 does carve out C3s from its donor disclosure mandates. But there are other aspects to the bill that could draw in C3s, including the endorsement of a constitutional amendment proposal that would allow Congress to decide what speech by corporations could be prohibited. And that's just a reminder that nonprofits are typically corporations. On the judicial side is probably our greatest source of hope right now. So in January, the Supreme Court agreed to hear the Americans for Prosperity Foundation v. Becerra, because this case has gone on so long that it's involved two attorneys general in California, neither of whom are attorney general of that state anymore. Amicus briefs requesting the court to overturn the Ninth Circuit ruling that the mandate was constitutional have been filed by organizations all across the political spectrum. The Council on American Islamic Relations, the ACLU, the Knight First Amendment Institute at Columbia University, the Cato Institute, Citizens United, and I have to disclose the Philanthropy Roundtable. But also on that list is the NAACP. And I'll remind you that the NAACP recently was awarded a $40 million anonymous gift to support the training of the next generation of racial justice attorneys. There are a variety of ways that case could be decided. The most desirable decision from our perspective in this case has been described by one observer as, quote, "We meant what we said in NAACP v. Alabama, and this time we're making it clear." If we get that sort of ruling, it will hinder other attempts to force donor disclosure by affirming that the right to associate privately and contribute to organizations anonymously are intrinsic to the effective exercise of the First Amendment, and that compelled disclosure of the identities of people who give generously to charity is unconstitutional. Thank you.
Thanks, Joanne. Yeah, and I think there may not be action in every area, but I think there will be action in this area in the next several years. So thanks for bringing this up. All right, batting cleanup. Cindy Lott, who is a associate professor of professional practice, and she runs the academic programs at Columbia University in philanthropy and nonprofits. Cindy.
Thank you so much. It's so great to see folks here, faculty and students. So I wanted to talk about also a number of issues that are here, but tie them up together, I guess. So I think that the question was asked about philanthropy, but one of the biggest shifts I think we're going to see is actually how we are dealing more with the nonprofit community writ large, also particularly in the service areas, those that are doing work in healthcare, environmental, et cetera. And I think it's for a lot of the reasons that we're actually hearing today. So We don't have representation, not great representation in this sector. That goes way, way back. We have had a lessening of regulation, as Ryan mentioned, in terms of enforcement and oversight. I've worked a long time with the regulators, both at the federal and the state level, and I can tell you that it's shifted over time, right? The states have become more interested and actually had more resources in some ways. The IRS has basically been told to step back and not do as much and be more of an administrative body. What I think we're going to see is a lack of representation and the combined effect, if you will, and the fact that we may not see overt regulation coming out of this administration in the first year or two, given lots of other things going on. I do think it's at our peril, however, if we don't pay attention to some of the other ways that we are going to have our sector implicated, if you will, and a number of them have already been raised here. So whenever you have money in the system, you're going to have regulation. That's DAFs. When you've got a Supreme Court case that's dealing with First Amendment issues, you're going to have decisions around it. There's no question about that. I've worked with both of the AGs in California on these issues in the Solicitor General's office there. There are lots of ways that the Supreme Court could decide that case, but the biggest issue there is that it is being implicated through the First Amendment, right? I also believe that we should be thinking about disclosure and having to define it. There's a difference between disclosing to government and disclosing publicly. This is a major issue there. Next up, though, is Congress as well, right? So we recently had Maxine Waters in February holding hearings about domestic terrorist groups and hate groups using exempt status to do fundraising. We've had reports around technology that's used constantly for fundraising for these groups. I think that's going to bring scrutiny through that particular door. The GAO, we know that the GAO has been asked to do different types of reports, different investigations over the years. I think we're going to see an uptick there because I think this particular Congress may very well be interested, and that's how you get a GAO report. And then, of course, the administration itself. We already know that Treasury is looking at 1023 EZs. I think it's only a matter of time that they're looking at a number of the different forms. I'm actually going to disagree with Ryan on a point. I think we actually have tons and tons of data. Whether we have the data we need, I work a lot around data and regulation. In fact, for those of you interested in attending, I'm convening an entire group around this, and 2 of your folks from IU are going to be speaking at it. Around data and having about 8 different state attorney general's offices and the FTC represented there on panels as well. The issue there is whether we're getting the data we need to help oversight. Good oversight is not necessarily more oversight. It can be thoughtful and consistent oversight. And we've seen a real shift in the balance over time from states and feds in that way. But through these back doors, I think we're going to have impact on our sector. And as we can quote Willie Loman's wife, attention must be paid. The question is, how is that going to happen? And is it going to come in through these different aspects? We as a society are grappling with 2 major crises right now on top of everything else, the pandemic and racial equity concerns. These, both of those concerns are forcing this particular administration to really have to deal with federal state interactions and also municipal, I would add, on community-based concerns and how they are going to actually deploy resources going down that chain. And nonprofits are integral to all of that action. So I think this administration is going to be basing a lot of what it looks at in our sector through the fact it's working with states and communities much more than a previous administration. And that's going to bring both help and possibly scrutiny as well. So ignoring what looks to be at these other levels is at our peril, as I say, as opposed to looking, oh, gee, did we have an actual piece around regulation around X? All of this is going to be impacting our sector. And at this particular juncture, there's good reason to both lift up the work that nonprofits are being done. But as always, when you do that, you are going to have scrutiny. It may just be coming from different places than we're accustomed to seeing. Patrick, I'll yield my time if there's any left.
Great, thanks, Cindy. And Rich posted a question that I was also going to ask. Cindy, can you provide a link for the conference that you referred to in case somebody here is interested, or is it limited
I can do
invitation.
that. I actually can have you send it out afterwards. I don't have
Sure.
my fingers on it at this moment for the chat
Yeah.
box, but yeah.
Okay, yeah, I'll send it around to everybody. All right, if other people have questions, please put them in the chat and we'll just try to take all of them in some semblance of order. And feel free to direct it to the panel or to an individual.
Patrick, I have a question that
Sure.
I'd love to ask. This is a question that was prompted by Cindy's comments, and I'm going to direct it to her, but I'd be happy to hear from other panelists as well. Cindy, you mentioned that the regulatory resources and energy have been shifting from federal to state as it relates to exempt organization stuff. And I'm just curious whether, in addition to your analysis of that having happened, like, can you talk to us a little bit about whether from your standpoint that has been a good thing or a bad thing, whether it should continue or whether it should be reversed? Like, can you give us a little bit on that? I'd be curious to hear your take.
I will just say this before anybody else that wants to answer. I probably shift might be a mischaracterization in the sense that it's not one pot of resources, it's going from one to the other. What it's been, and I will say that I gave an interview years ago to NPQ, to Nonprofit Quarterly, where I actually explained this in depth about how the states over time have actually become more elevated, not necessarily in how much work they do, because I've been in those offices, I know how much work they do, but in how much visibility they've had. It just so happens that it was coinciding with a time that we had the IRS being told by Congress, please don't do X and Y. I will also add to the dark money point that Joanne was raising, and I've got no problem calling it dark money because I think it is, and that is that we have, as a sector and as a society, rebelled against having any really good definitions between C3s and C4s, and we're about to, unfortunately, reap what we sowed there. For years, we have been talking about the split of C3s and C4s. We've had entire projects, the Brightline projects and others, that have attempted to make this more defined. But there are many players on both sides of the aisle that want to remain murky in that area. Well, here it comes, because now people want to talk about trying to really figure out where's that money going. That's what Maxine Waters wants to know. The Supreme Court, for all we know, may actually be raising that when it gets into the Schedule B litigation. And the states have decided to start looking at a lot of these things. States are looking at DAFs. States are looking at the C3, C4 split. They have concurrent jurisdiction on all of that. And so I think it's, again, at our peril that often as a sector, we actually have not clamored nearly as much as I wish we would have for representation over the years in these types of ways. So I applaud, and I work with Jeff at IS on the very platforms and different proposals they're putting forward. But the reality is the states have had to step up in some ways, and it has coincided with the feds being depleted in terms of both funding and also some intellectual capacity. There have been staffing issues for years in the EO division. And you know, they all sit under Treasury. So this is we shall see how they do this. They've been conflating the oversight office for some time now with the rest of oversight, and they are no longer carving out EO as a separate space. And that's problematic.
Just getting the structures you have in place, funded and doing the work they were intended to do would be a good start, right?
Yeah, I just wanted to say I appreciate that, and Cindy and Jeffrey, and yeah, I think it's important context for the Americans for Prosperity v. Becerra case that Joanne was referring to. I think that the context around the role of state AGs in oversight as the IRS's role has really sunsetted, and I also want to invoke some agents for that. It didn't just happen, right? That IRS exempt organization division happened to run out of resources, right? It was a plan on the part of a certain movement of folks in Congress to deprive the exempt organization of resources. So I just think that that's all important context for understanding the really, what I agree is a really important, could be a watershed moment for the sector in the form of this Supreme Court case.
Let me just jump in.
Okay.
Just
go ahead, John.
HR 1 does repeal the funding prohibitions on IRS rulemaking that were imposed, Ryan, in the time you're speaking of. So that could open the door to some rules around C3s and disclosure that we may or may not think are good things.
So we have a couple questions in the chat, so let's switch gears for a minute. Rich Steinberg asks, does anyone on the panel want to speculate on whether the change in political climate will affect the decline in the percentage of population that donates? And I might add that Lori Paulberg, who's our Mott Chair in Community Foundations and Philanthropy, has in the last year or two published a paper that shows that, I think I have this right, that counties that are tend towards being more Republican have a higher propensity to give than those that have a propensity to be higher Democratic counties, but that there's a tipping point of it gets to be too much of one party, then it actually dilutes the philanthropic contribution. So, but does anyone want to address that question?
I'll take a crack at that, or at least a piece of it.
Sure.
I think it's interesting that both at our practice for this session and today, when asked what are the things to expect, not one of us, myself included, really referred to tax policy or changes in tax law in any way. Now, tax law is not the only thing that affects percentage of the population that are givers, but it will have some effect, or at least we think it will have some effect. The stories are now beginning to occur. The New York Times has a big one this morning, having passed a $1.9 trillion bill. The discussions within the Biden administration are apparently turning to how do you pay for it? And the story is that the president is willing to contemplate an increase in tax rates, which would have, at least as I understand the economics, at least partly a positive effect on giving. Although this increase, according to the president's campaign promises, will affect only people earning over $400,000. I think it's probably couples, but I'm not sure how specific it was. But that would, of course, mean that insofar as higher tax rates would lead to higher giving, it'll be concentrated among upper income people. There has been no real discussion. Jeff may know differently about this, about any changes to the above the line deduction for gifts that came in with the CARES Act last year. Some of the early data I've seen anyway is that really didn't make much difference in terms of charitable giving. The other thing I just mentioned in this regard, the story in the Times this morning talks about something near and dear to those of us who have retired, changes in the estate tax policy. And there apparently the Biden administration is going to consider trying to realize more money from estate taxation and possibly also wealth taxation, which is still on the board, but from estate taxation. So I would expect something along those lines to occur. But again, we've seen in the past that changes in estate tax basically spur business for estate lawyers. People can figure out how to get around them and don't really do much to change incentives around, though to the extent they do, again, it'll be mostly above people with larger estates.
Hey, Patrick.
Yeah.
Yeah, let me just jump in quickly. So in response to Les's question about what we know or don't around the very small improvement that was made with the CARES Act around universal charitable deduction, but I don't think we have anything close to compelling data that would tell us the degree to which that had a real impact. I think what we are seeing and will continue to see is kind of a COVID giving bubble of sorts. The reality is, and we have been on this issue as independent sector, including working with Indiana University through a series of research efforts, to really look at a deeper problem that we have in the giving space, and it's a pipeline problem, right? So we are concerned not only about the number of dollars, coming into the system, which would be enhanced by way of a more expansive universal charitable deduction, to be sure, but we are also equally, if not more, concerned about the diversity, the strength of the pipeline of donors in this space, which is continuing to constrict, quite frankly, and we believe has accelerated post 2017 Tax Act. So, is the universal charitable deduction a more expansive version of the deduction the only solution to that? No. We believe it is absolutely part of the solution, and it is, is a body of work around which the sector continues to advocate very strongly. The Recovery Act, or the Rescue Plan Act, that was just passed did not do anything more on the universal charitable deduction. But I can tell you for sure that the sector is already at work and trying to get that initial provision extended and expanded.
Yeah, if I could just follow up on that, and then Cindy, I'll come back to you on that empirical point. Les, so we didn't model what would happen with the CARES Act because the work that we did came before that. But I mean, so here's one piece of evidence though that speaks to it is so when we looked at a universal charitable deduction without a cap, and then one with a $4,000 cap for individual, $8,000 for households. And basically what you find is that the one that is not capped has about a 50% greater increase in total household giving than the one with a cap. And so, I'll just say that, and we also know from our philanthropy panel study data that most itemizing households and non-itemizing households that give at all give way more than $300 or $600 if they give at all. So therefore, we think that this was kind of throwing the sector a bone and not really doing something to stimulate giving in a meaningful way. But and I don't mean that in a political sense. I just mean that empirically. All right, Cindy, back to you.
I just wanted to mention on this point, and I think there's some decent data out there, including your own Dr. Lenkowsky, who's studying some of this. I'm thrilled when we can talk about policy without invoking always the charitable deduction. I think it's actually been a fixation of this sector. I'm glad there are folks that do that, but I think it's been a fixation that actually has come at a cost, that we don't think about other aspects of policy in this space. And giving is one of those areas, because we know that people in this day and age that are younger people are often giving and don't care anything about a charitable deduction. Lucy Bernholtz has talked extensively and written extensively about this out of Stanford. Una herself, I think, is seeing the numbers about what has happened with COVID, and also after the murder of George Floyd, what in racial equity in communities, how people are giving. And it doesn't look the same as what we've necessarily seen before. And, it's like I asked my students at the beginning of their time in our program, what counts and who gets to decide what counts? We may be seeing many, many poor people, to Jeff's point around pipeline, but that are giving much smaller donations, or donations that no one else would track as a quote donation, because we don't necessarily know how to track it. And so in that sense, I will agree with Ryan. I'm not sure we've got great data on that piece, but it sure would go a long way so that it's not only about charitable deduction, which I think again is great, but is only getting to one slice of our society, and particularly right now. Equity is going to raise some of these issues. The equity concerns we are seeing now that aren't new, but are at the forefront, I think, are going to change some of this, but it may take some time to get there.
Yeah, I appreciate that, Cindy, and I just want to echo that. I was going to respond to this question by saying, I don't necessarily reject the premise that the composition of the donating public is changing in important ways, but I definitely want to echo what Cindy said, that I think we've seen, I think, a lot of really good impressionistic and journalistic data and good coverage on the rise of mutual aid networks that are happening a lot of the time facilitated by digital platforms. And to Cindy's point, I think this really does speak to the fractured nature of the data in the philanthropic sector, and just I think we should question whether we know for certain that fewer people are giving or that they're giving in different ways than they have in the past without some really good data from, for example, platforms that facilitate giving. And then one other just plug to a plus one for what Cindy said, that you know, at NCRP we really try to think about our own policy stances as an organization from a multiple bottom line standpoint, whereas I think that too often in the philanthropy sector, a lot of foundations and the organizations they support approach policy questions from a single bottom line question. How will this impact revenues from charitable deductions? And I think that, yeah, it really behooves us as a social sector to think much more broadly about a much more ecumenical, broader policy agenda that's going to benefit the people and communities and causes that we care most about. So,
I want to let Joanne make one more comment on this, and then I want to switch gears because Amir has asked a question. I want to make sure we get time to address that. So Joanne.
Actually, part of my answer is for the dean's question. So, I think that, you know, we've just been through the pandemic and we've been through just a lot of rethinking about racial justice in this country. The beneficiaries, and this has to do with what Amir asked about the public's perception of the nonprofit sector. All of this has pushed a lot of donors to be more local in their giving. And a ton of that giving came through community foundations and donor advice funds. Close to home, but more important, we were seeing the impact of the pandemic and racial injustice closest to home. If there's a sector that suffered through the pandemic, and it's going to kill me to say this because I live in Ithaca, New York, and I'm sorry that I'm addressing the Lilly School at Indiana University. I think higher education is coming out of this with less panache than it went into it with. There's been, whether you brought the kids back in person or you didn't, and you charged for, you know, remote learning and on board, and whether the kids came back and made COVID worse in their communities, to me, that may be the sector that, and I think, if I'm not mistaken, fundraising was down for that particular sector. It's unfortunate, but I think that is where you're seeing it. And obviously less interest in, unfortunately, the arts communities and the performing arts in general. So how we rebuild higher education and the arts community coming out of this, I think, is going to be a real challenge for philanthropy.
Yeah, thanks, Joanne. So Amir had asked, what are the salient trends in terms of the general public, not of nonprofit appreciation of the nonprofit sector, public's appreciation of the nonprofit sector? And Jeff, do you want to give a first response, and then we can open up to the panel? I also want to be mindful of the time. My alarm just went off to say, so if people need to jump off, feel free, but we'll at least follow up with this question.
Sure, just happy, you know, to give a thought or two. One of the things that we have been tracking at IS, quite frankly, is on this question broadly of public interest trust in the sector, right? And for a very long period of time, the sector, in comparison to for-profit and public sectors, actually scored, if you will, quite well in terms of public trust. We have been working with Edelman Intelligence to launch, our first was last year, 2 surveys. We believe they're the largest that have been done, one on public trust in philanthropy and one on public trust in nonprofits, 2 separate surveys. Our second annual survey is about to go out in the field later this quarter. And quite frankly, we're finding those numbers moving in the wrong direction. And so, you know, while the public is responding, and this we've learned through some recent public polling, that they look at the sector very favorably in terms of the role we have played in COVID response, there is something underlying that is of concern, which is a diminishing trust in all institutions, and we're not exempt, is what we're seeing. So more to come on that.
Thanks, Jeff.
You know, I'd like to just make a quick comment about that.
Sure,
I think it's important that when there are headlines in major publications and stories from within, particularly philanthropy, discussing things like dark money and some of these topics we've been discussing today and some of that positioning, although I recognize the intention of those who have that perspective, I think that calls into question the entire industry. And I recognize that the members of Indiana Philanthropy Alliance, for example, are working hard to address significant community needs. And, you know, it's difficult for those who might just be passing, kind of taking a quick cursory view of the industry to continue to hold us in esteem when some from within our industry are speaking in certain manners that might otherwise draw negative attention.
Thanks, Claudia. Well, let's give you the final word. And I want to thank the panelists and thank the participants. But if anybody has a question that they think of later or didn't get a chance to ask, shoot me an email and I will forward it to the panelists and get back to you electronically. And again, thank you, Cindy, Joanne, Les, Jeff, Brian, and Claudia for joining us today and providing a scintillating discussion on a topic near and dear to our hearts, or topics.
Thank you, Patrick. Thank you.
Thanks for the opportunity, Patrick. Bye, everybody.
Bye.
Stay well and
Thank
safe.
you.